Hey everybody, and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and today's lecture we're going to discuss cities or the rise of the development of cities in the early republic. But before we begin our lecture proper, I'd like to do our customary recap and just touch bases on what we discussed in our last lecture. So in our last lecture, we discussed the immigration, the mass influx of immigrants between 1870 and roughly 1920. We discussed how the immigrants were assimilated, the process of Americanization that developed and occurred, and also the type of immigrants. Mainly the ethnic types of immigrant, but also the skill set of the immigrants. So you had highly urbanized and industrial workers who already had industrial discipline, who were coming from locations where industrialization had already begun, and there was already a or a familiarity with industrial discipline and industrial concepts. Immigrants coming from Great Britain and, of course, Northern Germany already had this industrial discipline, this industrial background. Jewish immigrants from Russia didn't have this background. Immigrants from Italy didn't have this background. Immigrants from Poland didn't have this background. They were still rural agriculturalists, and they brought those skill sets here. Now, some of those immigrants did just move out off into the plains to become farmers, but more and more of them simply settled into cities and joined the urban industrial labor force. And of course, this mass influx of immigrants bred opposition, and we began to see the religious xenophobia, to where people, especially the Catholics, were discriminated against, and arguments were formulated to oppose the mass immigration of Roman Catholics. We also saw the rise of eugenics. And of racial and ethnic prejudices against immigrants. So, for example, books such as *The Passing of the Great Race* came out to sort of buoy that ideology, that line of thought, that these immigrants were somehow diluting the old stock of Americans, and that they were devaluing the United States with their presence. Okay, and now with that said, I'd like to dive right into our lecture for today. And let me begin by saying that cities grew very rapidly as the 19th century wore on. They were not planned on at all, and when they were planned, expansion of these cities, when they were planned, they were ill planned. The growth of these cities was fueled by industrial growth, and the massive waves of immigrations of immigrant settlers that came into these cities, and of course the big cities along the Atlantic seaboard. Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and also cities in the interior, places like Cleveland, Cincinnati, Chicago, Milwaukee, and so forth. They became, say, St. Louis even, they became drawing point, nexus points for immigrants. Immigrants knew that when they went to the cities, they would have all these industrial jobs, these factory jobs, so they flocked to the cities, and they flocked in large numbers, in droves, to these cities. Now, when they went to these cities, the industries that they were sort of like drawn to were the urban rail yards, the urban dockyards, and of course the slaughterhouses. Rural settlers also began to pour into the cities as well. There was this migration from the countryside into the cities as well. Another sort of little caveat, a little fact to chime in, to add on, was that at this time these cities were highly polluted. There was no concept of limited smokestacks, or limited the amount of fumes that were being sent into the atmosphere. There was a lot of coal burning going on, and a lot of these major cities they became known for the urban smog, for that urban fog, all the smoke that went into the atmosphere, for being covered in this dense this dense cloud of smoke. Not just smoke, but smoke and ashes. There was all these ashes also in the atmosphere. And again, that was because of the heavy use of coal. And to add on to the use of coal, coal wasn't just used for industrial purposes, but again, coal was being used for personal uses as well, for heating for heating private homes. Um, Now, the other hallmarks of the cities at the time were that the water was contaminated. There was poor sanitation all around, and of course, a large number of animals were kept in the cities, and that only worsened public health conditions. Epidemics were common as a result of this poor sanitation, and there was also a number of rough and ready political rings, and also well-established political machines like Aaron Burr's creation Tammany Hall in New York City. And these organizations, they provided assistance to the city population, particularly the immigrant population, in exchange for their political vote, their political support. But they tended to do little else. Men such as Boss Tweed and his Tammany Ring, when he controlled the Tammany Ring, they profited greatly from the urban governments and so forth, but they gave little back to the people living in their jurisdictions. Now, at the same time, a generation of Anglo-Saxon old stock Americans, mostly from the upper class, were trying to reform the city. They were launching the early or initial steps into urban reforms, and they were trying to generate improvements for the urban immigrants for their living conditions. And of course, all of this led to them champion, of course, the reforming of city governments. Now, in most cities, there was no oversight as to what type of regulation or what type of building got placed where. There were no zoning or regulatory policies, no zoning or regulatory commissions. This led to individuals buying a plot of land wherever they could buy one, building a structure on it, and then densely packing it with occupants to maximize their profits. Tenement buildings of the 19th century and also the early 20th century, they reflect this. One of the first people to explore this urban phenomena was Jacob Riis, who published a book. His book was entitled How the Other Half Lives. He published this book back in 1890. And How the Other Half Lives is a great classic of American literature. It is a very useful primary source for examining the living conditions of industrial immigrant workers. Land value was very high in the urban cities, so rents were high in the cities as well. There were also very few parks in the cities, and cities themselves lacked strong centralized control and could not set aside land to be protected from industrial use. Cities themselves didn't have any sort of strong mechanisms to fully govern or enforce anything. Now, another reason for overcrowding of the residential spaces was that industrial and urban workers had to live close to their employment. At this time, there were no urban transportation networks. Water access and sanitation were very problematic in the cities, as I noted earlier. And in southern states as late as the 1890s, the chief cities in the regions, cities such as Baltimore and New Orleans, still had open sewers. And New Orleans in particular, it was not uncommon in New Orleans to have raw sewage running through the streets. Other cities were just as bad. Philadelphia, there were thousands of cesspools, but really no sewage sanitation system. Boston, in Boston, the harbor was used as a deposit for sewage. Now, this had the effect of taking the sewage out to sea when the tide flowed out, but it brought the sewage right back in when the tide went in. So it seemed like a good solution, but in the long run, it wasn't a very good solution. Fires were also a great risk in the city. You have to remember that all the housing, all the building structures are primarily made of wood. It's a lot of wooden structures, about a lot of haphazard construction, because again, these the people who own the plots of land, they're just stacking housing structures onto the on their plots of land. They get putting up these tenements as cheaply as they can to maximize their profits. And everything was fire powered. If you want to heat your home in the winter, you're using coal and you're using fire. If you want to see at night, you're using a kerosene lamp and you're using some fire. So major fire hazard all around. And of course, cooking. If you're going to cook, you need the fire. Lighting up until the 20th century was really non-existent. As I stated earlier, if you're doing something at night, using kerosene for your lighting purposes. It was extremely common for city dwellings to burn down. So common that urban dwellers made it a spectator sport. Firefighting became a spectator sport of sorts for urban dwellers. It wouldn't be unusual to see people living in the city just wandering around the city watching local buildings burn. And then, of course, this was before the rise of municipal fire companies. So the job of putting out fires in any given community fell to adolescent boys, and the boys would vie for opportunity to extinguish the fire with each other, and sometimes they would physically fight one another for the opportunity. That of course meant that they spent as much time fighting fires as they did each other. And of course, the things in the cities, they at this point you just go from bad to worse. Animals were another problem in the city, and at this point we're not looking at the pet goldfish, the pet dog, the pet cat, the pet bird. We're looking at horses. We're looking at goats and chickens. Some people had cows in these cities. We're looking at farm animals still being kept in the city, and in particular with the horses. Horses were very prevalent in the cities at this time. And of course, this is before there's public transportation, so horses are the primary mode of transportation. And they were a major problem for city officials. Many of the first generation of urban planners thought of capping off settled cities like New York and Chicago because of horses. And the problem with horses was that they produced large quantities of manure. These cities were having a difficult time as it was handling the amount of human waste produced. Any increase in the amount of animal waste would simply just be unimaginable. It would be unfathomable for the people. Fearful projections stated that by 1910, large urban centers would be knee-deep in horse manure about all the time. Another problem with horses was that they died. They're animals, they're biological beings. They die. When a horse died in the street, it would very often require an additional team of horses to remove the carcass. Urban reformers and urban photographers captured images and told the tales of children playing in the streets with the carcasses of rotting animals, or the insufferable reality of starving immigrants butchering horses or goats or cow carcasses for the meat. And not fresh meat either. This would have been meat that was out there for a while that no city official had gotten to. And of course, you also run the risk of those immigrants who butchered the animals and took the meat of them falling victim to whatever the animal fell victim to. If the animal fell victim to some sort of epidemic, well, then the people have just eaten the animal. They've eaten the contaminated meat. They are now exposed to whatever the animal died from. And of course, you had the major slaughterhouse centers like Chicago and Cincinnati. Chicago was a major cattle slaughter center. Cincinnati, of course, was known as Porkopolis. It was where a number of pigs were sent for slaughter. You had the animals sent there, and of course, the waste products produced from the animals while they were waiting to be slaughtered, and of course, after they were slaughtered. Also rising up to become major problem for early city leaders. Uh, Upton Sinclair was somebody was a very important figure into one, the progressive movement, but also the understanding of cities and the lives of immigrants. For those who were able to receive meat from butcher shops, for those who didn't have to, go and hope for an animal to die and butcher the animal carcass to get meat. For those who went to the butcher shops, the quality of meat was not much better. For those who got meat from the slaughterhouses, the meat was not better. Death by food poisoning was a very real chance for urban dwellers. Emperor feuds were rampant up until about 1906. And Upton Sinclair, he was an urban reformer, and he wrote and published the classic novel The Jungle. And The Jungle told the story of an immigrant family, but primarily one immigrant in particular, working in the Chicago slaughterhouses. The trials and tribulations he endured, his friends endured in the slaughterhouses, and of course the quality of meat that was produced in the slaughterhouses. The Jungle prompted around the reform legislation related to food practices. Sinclair, who actually went undercover to research the practices of the slaughterhouses, presented a very accurate account of industry practices at the time. Now, Sinclair wanted the Jungle to promote socialism. He was a socialist. He wanted to promote socialism in the United States, but much to his chagrin, it didn't. It didn't. What the Jungle did was to promote food reform, and many young people who read the Jungle began to advocate for it. Many people who didn't even like Sinclair, who didn't even like reform, nonetheless threw their support behind it. Perhaps the most famous person in America to be affected by the Jungle was Theodore Roosevelt, who was the sitting president at the time. And Roosevelt reportedly gave up eating sausages after reading the Jungle, and he was said to be before then a sausage lover. He was really into having sausages with his breakfast. Roosevelt approached Congress to begin regulating how food was prepared in the United States, and a major outcome of all this was, of course, the passing of the Pure Food and Drug Act and the creation of the Food and Drug Administration, which to this day regulates consumer products in the United States. Now, the great industrial cities were habitually framed by smoke plumes. They had skies that were yellowish brown because of the amount of pollution, and many of the industrial cities, middle-class ladies took to wearing multiple pairs of gloves, because the first pair you would take out would simply become discolored. If you wore white gloves, they would be gray because of all the ash and the smooth in the atmosphere coming down to contaminate to discolor your gloves. So they took to wearing multiple pairs of gloves for outings. And of course, rivers. Rivers also were heavily polluted at the time. And rivers were polluted with personal and industrial waste. They created havoc for population centers who lived downstream from where the contaminants were first introduced. So you can imagine a place like Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh has, of course, the three rivers flowing there. You can imagine the industrial waste being dumped in by the city of Pittsburgh, and of course the personal waste being dumped in by the city of Pittsburgh. You can think of cities upstream on a river dumping things in. You could think of people in Chicago either dumping goods into Lake Michigan or into the Chicago River, and how that was sort of just spread pollutants to different population centers, and the list really just goes on and on. And of course, the big thing with these cities were the political machines. City governments, wherever there was a sitting government, a real government, they were operated by a political machine. And at this time, these machines provided. They really did provide the basic services for immigrants, but all of this was done for in exchange explicitly for their vote, for their support. These immigrants will be shown the ballot. They will be shown who to endorse. And there's a very famous cartoon with Boss Tweed standing over a jar, a glass jar, so that he could see and ensure that that the immigrant men voted the way they were supposed to vote. There are all these tales of vote buying. Of course, you'd be paid $2 after voting. So for people coming from Italy and the Austrian Hungarian Empire or the Russian Empire, where one, there was no voting rights, and where two, people, the average citizen didn't have the right to vote. If voting was allowed, the average citizen didn't have the right to vote. To not only be told that you were going to vote but be paid to vote, this was a boon. This was a godsend. They would offer to vote more than once. Voting more than once was already something that the boss were going to have them do. But the very lucky, the very ingenious, the very enterprising would go to different ward bosses and say, "Hey, I voted over there, but if you give me another $2, I'll vote here for you," and simply, double up on their money. It was a very real thing. But these political machines who govern these cities, they enrich their leaders through municipal fraud. Of course, Boss Tweed of Tammany Hall, William Tweed, he ran the Democratic political machine in the city, and he held a monopoly on the patronage in New York City, dispensing it as he saw fit. Under Tweed, every municipal contract included a bribe payable to him and his chief lieutenants. And though much maligned for his corruption, Tammany Hall and William Tweed were effective in city management. City bosses did provide key services to the immigrant communities upon arrival. They will very often ensure that recent immigrants got something to eat and were able to find shelter as soon as they arrived. They were able to find work for these immigrants, and they were able to address any sort of misfortune that befell these immigrants. They did in that way provide very necessary, very needed services for their constituents. And the ward bosses, they would have a finger on the pulse of all the activities in their wards. Everyone who living under their jurisdiction will be familiar with the ward boss, and the ward boss will be roughly familiar, if not intimately familiar, with the basic affairs, the basic needs and necessities of their constituents. And with that being said, we'll break here, and we'll come back with part 2 of our lecture on cities. As always, I'm Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment, and I'll see you guys next time.